Did you get the note, Billy? Darrell? Okay. Good evening. Jerry, Jeannie, y'all are inspiring, okay? You're just inspiring. Do we need to have another talk about your kids, Hannah? I'd have a dozen if I were you. No, he just came in, so Nick is just, I'll let him tell you. Anyway, we're going to sing God is So Good. It's number 23 in the hymn book, if you like, and then we're going to sing He Is Here. Join us as we stand and sing. He is here. Join us now as we welcome each other in fellowship.
Do I? That's torture. As we get started this evening, we will take your prayer concerns and study of Genesis. We're in Genesis chapter 48 today, or tonight. And this time we're going to look at Jacob blessing Joseph's sons. And so, as we get started, one of the things I try to help us with in this particular study is to keep on the biblical timeline as far as when these events were happening. The events of chapter 48 happened right on the heels of chapter 47, because at the end of chapter 47, we're basically told that Jacob is, on death's doorstep, that he's, taking a turn, so to speak. And so that was in 47. Here in 48, Joseph is notified and goes to see Jacob. So this gets us on the timeline of world history around the year 1639 BC. And so tonight, as we start off, we're going to be in verses 1 through 7, and we're going to see how Jacob addresses Joseph and his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So let's look at verses 1 through 7. It says, "Sometime after this, Joseph was told, 'Your father is weaker.' So he set out with his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. When Jacob was told, 'Your son Joseph has come to you,' Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. Jacob said to Joseph, 'God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. He said to me, I will make you fruitful and numerous. I will make many nations come from you, and I will give this land as a permanent possession to your future descendants. Your two sons born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are now mine. Ephraim and Manasseh belong to me just as Reuben and Simeon do. Children born to you after them will be yours and will be recorded under the names of their brothers with regard to their inheritance. When I was returning from Paddan, to my sorrow, Rachel died along the way, some distance from Ephraim in the land of Canaan. I buried her there along the way to Ephraim, that is Bethlehem.'" So sometime after Joseph's meeting with Jacob about, burial arrangements that we read about in chapter 47, Joseph had swore to bury Jacob in Canaan. And Joseph gets word now that Jacob is getting weaker. So what we find is that Joseph left Memphis, the capital, and he headed north to the land of Goshen so that he could take his sons Manasseh and Ephraim to see Jacob. And when Jacob heard that Joseph had arrived, he perked up and was ready for a visit. He sits up in the bed. He's, and we've all seen that with loved ones, maybe grandparents or maybe even parents, when they're close to death. It may be that they are not doing well, and then they get a visit from a child or a grandchild or a friend or a sibling, and they walk in and they just sort of perk up. And that's really what happens here with Jacob at this moment. And so Jacob tells his son Joseph, tells him about how God appeared to him at a place called Luz, and Luz is actually the same place that we know as Bethel or Bethel. And so this is the place where Jacob is on his way escaping from Esau, heading to Paddan Aram. As he heads there, he stops at Luz or Bethel, and this is where he interacts with God at a time where he has this vision of the staircase or the ladder going up and down to heaven. And so he shared that at that moment, God shared with him the Abrahamic covenant about how the same one that God had shared with Abraham and Isaac and even Jacob all those years ago. And the covenant consisted of the same things that we have talked about for a long time now as we've looked at everything post-Abraham, or actually from Abraham coming forward. It was the covenant that consisted of many descendants, nations coming from them, and the land of Canaan as a possession for Abraham's family. And so Jacob goes on to tell Joseph that not only, hey, has God made this promise to my grandfather, my father, and myself, and it's going to continue on through our family, but now Jacob's saying, in addition to that, I'm going to claim your sons as my own, talking about Manasseh and Ephraim. And he's claiming them just as if they were his biological sons. And so any other children that would be born to Joseph that had been born to Joseph while he was in Egypt would be counted, would be considered his, but they would actually fall under Manasseh and Ephraim in the Jewish inheritance of land and the tribal allotments and all that would come down the road. Now, we talked a couple weeks ago about this discrepancy between the 70 and the 75 people who went to Egypt from Canaan. And this may have to do with some of Joseph's kids that were born after Manasseh and Ephraim being considered in that lineage. And so they may have been alive when Jacob came to Egypt, but they may have just been counted there in that way. But nevertheless, Jacob took an unexpected detour, though. He's giving him this outline. Hey, here's the Abrahamic covenant. Your sons are now first two sons are my sons. And now he just sort of goes off into left field talking about Joseph's mother, Rachel, because he mentioned the death of Rachel near Bethlehem while traveling back from Paddan Aram down to Canaan. And maybe it was his way of reminding or maybe telling Joseph about, where his mother was buried, reminding him of the events, because Joseph has been out of the picture for, many years. I think it was 22 years that he was out of the picture. And Jacob may not remember what Joseph knows or remembers about those events, much less where his own mother is buried. And so it could have been that Jacob was having just one of those situations that we sometimes find with individuals that are close to death, where they start talking about people who used to be alive and are no longer there, and things in the past and talking as if it's in the present. And so Jacob may have just been sharing, something like that, but nevertheless, we know that he shares with Joseph about where his mother is buried and the events that happened there. And it had been nearly 40 years since Joseph had been in Canaan. So it'd been a long time. And Jacob may have been worried that Joseph no longer remembered where she was buried or the circumstances concerning that. But we see in verses 8 through 16, we find that Jacob blesses Manasseh and Ephraim. Look at verses 8 through 16 with me. It says, "When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, 'Who are these?' And Joseph said to his father, 'These are my sons God has given me here.' So Israel said, 'Bring them to me and I will bless them.' Now his eyesight was poor because of old age. He could hardly see. Joseph brought them to him and he kissed and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, 'I never expected to see your face again, but now God has let me see your offspring.' Then Joseph took them from his father's knee and bowed with his face to the ground. Then Joseph took them both with his right hand Ephraim toward Israel's left, and with his left hand Manasseh towards Israel's right, and brought them to Israel. But Israel stretched out his right hand and put it on the head of Ephraim, the younger, and crossing his hands, put his left hand on Manasseh's head, although Manasseh was the firstborn. Then he blessed Joseph and said, 'The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys, and may they be called by my name and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow to be numerous within the land.'" So Jacob is, perked up and engaged in this conversation with Joseph, and he sees Manasseh and Ephraim, and he asks Joseph about them, wanting to know, who they are. And we can be certain that this was not the first time that Jacob had seen his grandsons in the 17 years that he had lived in Egypt. So it wasn't that he didn't know who they were. It was more because of his eyesight being poor. He just couldn't recognize who was in the room with him. And so, he didn't know who was with Joseph, much like if you think back in Jacob's life to the time when Jacob takes advantage of his father Isaac's poor eyesight and puts some goat hair on his arms and wears his brother's robe and takes the blessing from Isaac. This was, an opportunity for Joseph to do this, to take advantage of Jacob's poor eyesight, but he doesn't. And so what we find is that Jacob offered to bless the boys. And that type of blessing is meant to request that God's favor would rest upon them. That's what that kind of a blessing would be. And so here he is wanting to bless them. And if you think about it, Manasseh and Ephraim are, at this point, he's claiming them as his sons. And so he's giving them basically the same kind of blessing that Jacob would give to the rest of his boys here in the next chapter. And so what we find is that, he's wanting to give them this blessing so that God's favor would rest on them as individuals and then as a family and then as a tribe. And that's what he's hoping will happen. And so Joseph took his boys and he took Manasseh, his oldest son, in his left hand, and Ephraim, excuse me, I went to the doctor this week. They put me on some medicine, and I'm just waiting for it to kick in and my voice to come back stronger. So I apologize for the coughing again. So Manasseh is in his left hand, and Ephraim is in his right hand. And when he presents them to Jacob, what that means is that Manasseh would be on Jacob's right, and Ephraim would be on his left. And the reason for that was that when blessings like this occurred, it was always with the right hand that was placed on an individual for that blessing. There's a lot of references in the scriptures about God rescuing us with His what? His righteous right hand. So if you're left-handed, like my wife, I don't know what kind of blessings God has for you, but no. I know Terry's left-handed too. So, but the right hand was seen to be, because predominantly people are right-handed. That is viewed to be the hand of power or strength and blessing, and that's why when Joseph presented them to Jacob, he wanted to make sure that his oldest son, who should receive the primary blessing, would be on Jacob's right-hand side. And so he pushes them forward to their grandfather. And when this happens, Jacob just, like my grandmother would do at times, just undo any plans you had made, and things would just go, off the rails. And that's what Jacob does in this moment. He instead of putting his right hand on Manasseh, he reaches across and puts his right hand on Ephraim, and then his left hand, his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Manasseh, which means that Ephraim would get the primary blessing as being the older son, and even though he was not. And so Jacob's blessing, it invoked the name of God as the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac, as well as the God of Jacob. And he mentioned how God had redeemed him from harm, how he had asked God to bless Ephraim and Manasseh, and he asked God to make their descendants numerous. And so, this was his, what he wanted for two young men that he was taking as his own sons at this point. He wanted God to bless them the same way that he wanted God to bless his other sons. And so we find that in this moment, Jacob seems to have, with the with his poor eyesight seems to have caused an issue with the blessings. But as we'll see in a minute, that was exactly what Jacob planned for. And if you're a student of the Bible, you know that into the future, Ephraim is a much stronger and more powerful tribe than Manasseh. And here he is blessing them in that way. So look at verses 17 through 20 with me. It says, beginning with verse 17, it says, when Joseph saw that his father had placed his right hand on Ephraim's head, he thought it was a mistake and took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's. Joseph said to his father, not that way, my father. This one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He too will become a tribe, and he too will be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his offspring will become a populous nation. So he blessed them that day, putting Ephraim before Manasseh, when he said, the nation Israel will invoke blessings by you, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, I want you to think about this. So we read right here that Jacob is making this switch in the birth order, so to speak, for Ephraim and Manasseh. And a lot of times when we read about them in the scriptures, we don't read about them as Manasseh and Ephraim. It's usually Ephraim and Manasseh is the way that they're referred to. And so from really earlier in this chapter until right now, and in any other reference, which I think there was one other reference a couple chapters ago, it would have been Manasseh and Ephraim, but going forward, it's always Ephraim and Manasseh. So what Jacob does here has a long-standing impact on the tribe or the nation or the nation of Israel and the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. So although Joseph would have been grateful, although Joseph would have been grateful for the blessing on his boys from his father, he noticed the problem. He noticed the sleight of hand, if you want to call it that, with Jacob, that he had placed his right hand for that primary blessing on Ephraim, the younger son, and placed his left hand for the lesser blessing on Manasseh, who was the older son. And so Joseph probably just chalked it up to bad eyesight. I mean, we would have done the same thing if we were in that situation. We're like, oh, he can't see who he's, he didn't even know who was in the room. There's no way he knows whose head he's putting his hand on. And Joseph tried to fix this. But interestingly, Jacob's like, no, I know what I'm doing, and refuses to change that or to do differently. And so Jacob, in this text, he assured Joseph that Manasseh would become a tribe, that his family and his descendants would be a great tribe and would do great things. They would become a populous tribe. But he confirmed that Ephraim's tribe would just be greater. That's what, not that nothing, he didn't have anything bad to say about Manasseh's tribe, but he's just like, look, Manasseh's going to be a good tribe, but Ephraim's just going to be a more populous, a greater, more powerful tribe. And as I said a few moments ago, we see that played out in the pages of Scripture, that Ephraim is really probably only second to Judah in real power, maybe Benjamin. Benjamin, Judah, and Ephraim are really the top three tribes in the nation of Israel into their time of settling in the promised land and things like that. And so this blessing by Jacob is a powerful one for the nation of Israel, but especially for descendants of Ephraim. And so, we see that, Ephraim's just going to be a more powerful tribe than Manasseh. And so going forward, more changed for Manasseh and Ephraim than who received the primary blessing, because like I said, that birth order was switched, so to speak, with Jacob, and now they would be referred to going forward as Ephraim and Manasseh. And he even told them that the nation of Israel, in that last verse there in verse 20, that the nation of Israel would invoke this blessing on each other or in ways, and would say, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. meaning that both of them had turned out to be great tribes, and Ephraim was a powerful tribe. But Jacob's saying, hey, look, God's going to use them to be a blessing in that way for others, that they would be like, hey, we want to be like Ephraim and Manasseh. So look on into verses 21 and 22, and this is where we get to ask the question, if Jacob's continued favoritism, if it's continuing with Joseph. So look at 21 and 22. Israel said to Joseph, look, I am about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you back to the land of your fathers. Over and above what I am giving your brothers, I am giving you the one mountain slope that I took from the Amorites with my sword and bow. So Jacob told Joseph that basically he knew his time was coming to an end. And, sometimes individuals just know that, and this is one of those cases. Maybe God gave him some sort of insight to the fact that that his time was coming to an end. But he also told Joseph, God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. And so what that means is that Jacob here is telling Joseph that he will not stay in Egypt forever, that his body would not stay in Egypt forever. And here is something interesting that I read this week. I didn't know this. It said that in the Hebrew, in that particular verse, that's verse 20. In that verse, the words you and your in the Hebrew are both plural. And meaning that Jacob was alluding to the entire nation of Israel, not just Joseph. Meaning that you as a nation, not just you as an individual, that you, like we would say here in the South, y'all are going back to your homeland. Y'all are going back to Canaan. And that's basically what Jacob is telling Joseph, is that you will go back, but so will everybody else. Meaning that the nation of Israel would not permanently be a part of Egypt. And we would see this happen when the Exodus occurs. The Israelites brought the bones of Joseph, we're told. They brought the bones of Joseph with them and carried them for 40 years. For 40 years until they reached the promised land. And so Jacob also gave Joseph what seems to be a double portion of the inheritance. And Reuben, who was the oldest son, should have received a double portion as the oldest son. But what we do know is there is precedent in the scriptures for at certain times where a son has stood out and has taken on that position or that mantle of leadership and acted as a firstborn son and done the things that were needed, that they would at times receive a double portion. And because of Joseph's position in the family and him providing for the family in Egypt and having a place for them to come, like the oldest son should have done, what we see is that Jacob gave him a double portion. And that was because basically Joseph had stepped up and done the role of the oldest son. Now remember, when it came to these inheritances, they were split evenly, but the oldest son would get a double portion. It's a whole lot more difficult to say how much you get when there's 12 of them. But when you think about if there's just 2 of you, it's going to get divided 3 ways, and the first one gets 2/3. That's the easiest way to look at it. And so that, he would get a double portion. He'd get twice as much as whatever brothers are remaining. And so that's what happens here with Joseph because of the position. Now, it would be easy for us to say, it ain't because he's stepped up and been, the go-to guy here for him. It's just, another version of the coat of many colors. But that's really, and that's what I always thought it was until I read something this week that said that what's really going on here is that Joseph has stepped up and acted as the oldest son, and so he is the one that receives this double portion because of his position and what he's done. And this is even mentioned in 1 Chronicles 5:1, where the rights as firstborn were taken from the sons of Reuben and given to the sons of Joseph. And so it's not just a biblical scholar saying, hey, I think this is why this is happening. We see this as in Scripture here in 1 Chronicles 5:1, that's actually what happened. Now, the extra portion of the inheritance that Joseph is going to receive was the one mountain slope that I took from the Amorites with my sword and bow. Now, in your translation, it may say something other than the one mountain slope. Does anybody's translation say the ridge? Does anybody say anything other than the ridge or one mountain slope? The ridge, and that's really what it is. It's actually, the word that is used there is the same word that is used for the name of the city of Shechem, and if you remember, that's the city where Dinah is kidnapped and raped, and that's also the one where two of Jacob's sons go and wholesale slaughter all the men in the city, and they take the women and the children and the livestock as plunder. And so this portion of the land would be in the inheritance that Joshua would give to the descendants of Joseph, i.e. Ephraim and Manasseh, and that's where Joseph would be buried. You see that? Go back one, Darrell, for me. They're going to come... They left from Hebron and Beersheba and came down to Egypt, but eventually when they come through the wilderness, they'll come back and cross about right here to go into the Promised Land. But eventually Joseph's body would be buried there on that land in Shechem. And now you can show that next picture. And that's actually the tomb. If you're ever in Israel, that is a place that you can go to. That dome-shaped area is the tomb where Joseph is supposed to be buried. And so that's actually a place that you can go and visit. But we read about them burying the bones of Joseph in what was Shechem, in that area. That's actually in the modern day city of Nablus. It's not called Shechem anymore, but that's where that's at. But in Joshua 24:32, that's where we read that Joseph's body or his bones are placed or buried in Shechem. So that brings us to the end of our look at the actual scriptures tonight. But as always, we want to see what lessons we can learn from this particular text. And in this one, we learn that blessings from God, or that blessings come from God regardless of our approach. Regardless of how we approach a situation or a time in life, God's going to bring about blessings as He sees fit. Joseph left Memphis with the idea that if there were any sort of patriarchal blessing to be passed along from Jacob, he knew that he would be blessed. He knew that God would do that, and as was the custom, now, while he's there, Joseph was probably expecting some kind of a blessing from his father. And here Joseph is told, hey, by the way, your sons, they're my sons now, and I'm going to bless them. And he would have assumed that with the custom of the oldest son being blessed primarily, or having that primary blessing, that Manasseh would have been the first one to be blessed. It would have been the greater of the two blessings, and it would have been different than what Ephraim would have received. But also Joseph would have expected that his own blessing from Jacob would sort of fall in line with his 10 brothers who came in line after the oldest son, Reuben. But what we see is that God had other plans when it came to these blessings. And so God used Jacob to be that sort of vessel, to use him as that means of delivery for the verbal promise of these blessings. And so Ephraim, as we saw, was blessed as a primary recipient of the blessings between him and Manasseh. And Joseph received the traditional double portion, as we said, of the inheritance as the primary recipient of the blessings among his brothers. And so Joseph's his blessing was way different than what he expected, and the blessing for his sons was way different than what he expected. And so Joseph, tried to fix Jacob's mistake with Ephraim and Manasseh because it wasn't what was traditionally expected. It wasn't what he was thinking that blessing would be. And Joseph didn't deter Jacob, though, when receiving his blessing. He didn't say, well, Dad, Reuben's really the oldest. He should get the double portion. Joseph took what blessing Jacob offered to him. So what we see here in these blessings is that God knew what he was doing. God knew what he was doing when he had Jacob to bless Ephraim, Manasseh, and Joseph in the way that he did. Because when God seeks to give blessings to us, whatever form they come in, what we have to understand is we can trust God that he's going to do what is correct in dishing out blessings in the way that he does it. We can trust that whatever blessings he gives us in whatever form or fashion is what he knows we need. He gives it to us in the right way. Regardless of cultural or societal or traditional norms, if God chooses to bless us or bless differently, I guess I should say, than we might normally expect, then we must be like Joseph when Ephraim was blessed and understand that it's part of God's plan. It might be different than what we thought it would be. It's different, may look different, but it's still what God had planned. Now, we may not understand it, but in the end, God is the one from whom those blessings come, regardless of our approach or our view of how those blessings should be handed out. And we have to remember that we can trust him regardless of what that blessing may be. We talk about these blessings, and it made me think about something that was shared in Sunday school this morning here in the sanctuary when David talked about how we usually think about blessings as prosperity. That's a lot of times what we think is that when we think about blessings, we naturally think about prosperity of possessions or finances and things like that. And there was never a promise of any of that for Ephraim. Now, granted, Joseph was given a double portion of land or extra land, if you want to call it that, but in the reality, it shows us that not every time that God blesses us is it going to be some form of possession or some sort of wealth or anything like that. I think that we would all probably agree that there are many more blessings that God has given us that were not financial, were not a possession, that we probably hold way more dear to us than the time when he showed up with a check when times were lean and we needed money or whatever the case may be. That we think about those blessings, whether it's our families like it was for Joseph and Jacob and their tribes, or whether it's other things that God has done. And so we're very grateful for the blessings that he gives us regardless of what format they come in and regardless of the approach that we think those blessings should come through. So that is our study for tonight. Are there any questions or comments or thoughts? Now somebody's got to ask a question. Alta can't be here tonight, and we were talking about that tonight over there. Said she got a kick out of somebody mentioning, said, Pastor Nichols, are there any questions? And Alta's hand goes up, and he's like, anybody but Alta. And she got a kick out of remembering that. But are there any questions this evening? Well, we'll just take it easy tonight then. So Alta did ask me a question concerning the death of Joseph weeks ago, and asked me to have it prepared for when we have our study in 2 weeks, and so in a couple of weeks, so we'll do that for sure. But if there's not any other questions or anything, we'll close up tonight or Wednesday night. We will be in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. As long as we have services. The reason I say that is not knowing when the funeral home will be able to do Grant's service. They're looking at having a later in the day service, whether it's Wednesday or Thursday. We don't know, but I told them that if it's later in the day on Thursday, then we'll end up canceling services because we won't be able to get everything done and the meal for the family and everything handled in that way. So we'll spread the word if we end up having to cancel services on Wednesday. I don't know that we will, and we won't know anything probably until tomorrow. I know we won't know anything until tomorrow. But if we do have services, we'll be in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. And then next Sunday morning, we're going to be looking at an example of what it means to give generously from the pages of Scripture and see what that looks lived out. And then next Sunday night, we'll be in Genesis chapter 49. And so, and that's where, if I'm not mistaken, that's when Jacob blesses and curses some of his, or all of his boys. And so we'll be doing that. But just a reminder, if you're able to come and help with the workday on Saturday, we're getting started at 8 o'clock. And we've got some stuff inside. We've got the cabinets in the library to move and trees out back to cut and work on. So if you can help with either one of those, it'd be great for you to be here at 8 o'clock on Saturday morning. And so with those things being shared, I'm going to ask Keith, if he would, to close us with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed.